Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's really it's an honor to have you here at our School of Graduate Studies Invites. It's a thing that we developed in the graduate studies to invite all sorts of different platforms of different kinds of people, different lectures, different events, performances. And this particular one is the first one that our Dean, Mary Davis, is going to take part on. So we're very excited to have her. So Mary, please come to the stage. This is Mary Davis, my favorite person in the world, well, one of many, except for Keanan, but he's the second favorite. He's your favorite. This is my favorite. So anyway, Mary invited Keanan, so Keanan, please join us. So basically, we're going to talk about music, fashion, and everything in between. So the first thing that we're going to do is get Keanan and Mary to tell you a little bit about them and their relationships with music and fashion, and then we're going to kick into this wonderful presentation that Keanan's built for us. Then I'm going to jump in and do a little bit of prodding and provoking, and then we're going to go and open it up to you and have fun, guys. Enjoy, and let's have some rock and roll party.
Feel free to heckle us.
I go in the middle. So, Mary, would you like to go first and tell us a little about your relationship between fashion and music?
Sure. First, I'd just like to say how happy I am that you're all here. One of the things, I've been at FIT for about 6 years, and one of the things that I have really wanted to do is to bring some music into this place, because we deal so much with creative industries, creative arts, fashion, design, all sorts of things, but we really have not established a profile when it comes to music. So this is a starting point tonight that I hope we will be able to continue and keep building. My relationship to music and fashion goes way back. I studied classical piano pretty seriously, got a master's degree in piano performance from the Peabody Conservatory a long time ago, and then went to work and worked as a tax lobbyist and did all sorts of things in Washington, D.C. that had absolutely nothing to do with music or arguably fashion, working in Washington as a lobbyist. It was way before people like Hope Hicks were in the Capitol. And eventually I found my way back to music and did another master's degree and then a PhD in musicology, so music history. And I did that degree at Harvard, and the subject of it was a composer, a French composer named Eric Satie, who lived from 1866 to 1925. And everybody just considered Satie to be a complete outlier and oddball, probably why I was so attracted to him in the first place as a subject. What nobody realized, though, was that he had deep and very interesting connections to the world of fashion. And I could go on and on about that, but I will not. We'll save that for another time. The one thing that most people, anybody who knows anything about him, remembers about his fashion sense is that when he finally inherited a little bit of money, because he was super poor, and an uncle died and he inherited a little bit of money, and he went out immediately and bought 10 identical maroon velvet suits, which he wore over and over again, and he earned the nickname the Velvet Gentleman based on that. But my research uncovered a whole different set of connections to the fashion world and to high society in Paris in the 1920s, teens and 20s, but especially in the 1920s. So he was circulating with Coco Chanel. Chanel was having an affair at that time with one of the hottest composers in Paris or in the world, Igor Stravinsky. So there was a connection between music and fashion to be explored there as well. It led me to not only write a dissertation on the topic of music and fashion with Satie in the middle, but then to write a book about music, fashion, and modernism, which is called Classic Chic, and then to look at dance as well, and to write a couple of books about the ballet russe and the way that music and fashion come into play there. So after that, I went to work for about 12 years in Cleveland, Ohio, where I did a lot of work for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum. I was the chair of the music department at Case Western Reserve, and we started a collaboration with the Rock Hall and created a Popular Music Institute there. So we were always looking at the relationship between music and fashion in that context. And then somehow I got on the radar screen of FIT and got recruited for the job I currently hold as Dean of the School of Graduate Studies, where I have limited opportunity to talk about music and fashion. So as I said, I'm thrilled to be here with Keanan and Kyle tonight.
Well, I'm glad you could do it. So this is quite a contrast, which is why I set this up, because I know it's going to be a really interesting conversation. So Keanan, tell us your story.
Well, my name's Keanan Duffty. I'm a fashion designer, musician, and fashion educator. And actually, I first came across Eric Satie through an 80s new romantic band called Japan, who my wife loves, David Sylvian. I'm being sarcastic here. She hates David Sylvian. But they had a song on one of their albums called Night Porter, which was a gentle piano piece. And it was supposedly influenced by Eric Satie. But what I was most interested in was David Sylvian's haircut and his leather jacket. And that's really what kind of brought me into fashion, is really loving what musicians wore. I was really fascinated by the way that the kind of iconic musicians that I looked to, which for me were people like David Bowie, Brian Ferry from Roxy Music, and then later the Sex Pistols, Vivienne Westwood's, the band that were dressed by Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren, and onward, and that kind of drew me into fashion. Today, you'll see behind us as we're chatting a bunch of images that really span several decades of music. The subject that we're talking about today is really super broad. It's not really something you could speak to within 45 minutes, but I think we're going to try and do a little bit of that. We're going to show how eras in music had a fashion component, which actually resonates today. Many influences that have happened within music and within fashion are on a big cycle. They come around and around. They evolve in different ways. And you would have heard when you were walking in some so-called mashups of music, taking Bessie Smith and layering her vocal over Radiohead, taking Louis Armstrong and putting him together with the Wu-Tang Clan, taking Rihanna and mashing her together with the Stranglers. That's really what I feel is happening very much in fashion today. There's a lot of kind of mashing up happening because we're in an era where, frankly, much that could be done in fashion has been done. So now we're in this time where we're revisiting ideas from the past, where brands are, supposedly collaborating with other influencers. Where Gucci, for example, is going to the Harlem designer Dapper Dan, who created very Gucci-inspired garments in the 80s, and they're actually collaborating with him, and that would have been unheard of before this era in fashion. So I think we really are in the age of the fashion mashup. And that's where, for me, music and fashion really intersects. They're strange bedfellows, and I think many musicians would say they're not in the least bit interested in fashion, and many fashion designers would say that music's a bit grungy and musicians are a bit scruffy. But they do really influence each other, and so we're going to explore that a little bit today.
Yeah. So may I ask that you start the slideshow from the beginning again? Sorry, we were meant to kick off with this bit. So can you start that again? Because we're halfway through the slideshow, and I think it's with the storytelling starts at the beginning, and you're going to talk about a bit of a timeline. Yeah.
It doesn't actually matter so much with the slides. I think they're not really. We're going to dip in and out of the imagery. It's more for you guys to be entertained with a bit of visual candy.
Okay. And they'll provide some reference points as we're going along. But just to pick up on your point, Keanan, it may be that fashion and music disavow one another, but for those of us who are in the middle of those two things, our choices about fashion and music are really powerful, profound expressions, I think, of our identity. That's what fascinates me about this. So it's really about taste, what your choice of clothing, what your choice of music says about you, how you present yourself.
Yeah, I find what's interesting to me about music, if you look at a particular era of music, we've got a lot of imagery from the 1950s, from the rock and roll era, and you kind of see sort of a transition in some of these earlier images where music is coming from an ethnic minority, African Americans. It's a folk music. It has its own microculture happening that's not actually out into the mainstream. And then you see Madison Avenue recognizing that teenagers have money to spend and that music can be commodified. That sort of historically has happened throughout the history of music, from the jazz age to rhythm and blues, rock and roll, Motown, soul, Stax, punk rock, reggae. Everything gets commodified ultimately. Music is a music business as fashion is a fashion business. They are art forms, but they're linked to a commerce. And so I think, we do see that commodification, and that's why fashion and music, I feel, do sit together quite comfortably.
And some of the images that you're seeing up here are images of magazines and other kind of publications. So in terms of consumerism, commodification, identification, I think that the print press and now the digital media have played a really important role in bringing fashion and music and beauty together as a comprehensive story.
Yeah. I mean, I see, we're looking at images here from the kind of pop youthquake of the 60s. And I think that was really the first time post-war in the UK where the teenager was identified as a demographic, that could be marketed to. And so with the advent of beat groups, of the British invasion, of the Beatles, the Stones, Kinks, and so on and so forth, there was this almost very commercialized world happening, and you had Bieber, you had Mary Quant, you had mass fashion happening at that time too, which is, the two sort of were happening simultaneously. And then you hit 1966, 1967, when there's this explosion in the counterculture, and it's the year when, the voice of the civil rights movements in full swing, gay rights are happening, coming to the forefront, and you have a poet, a social commentator like Bob Dylan, for the first time putting words, formulating a message that people are thinking about and putting them into a musical format. And that expression was also happening in fashion, which is kind of phenomenal.
And Keanan and I were talking before we started up here about how those kind of moments, those moments of confluence happen every so often in a year that is an 8-year. Like 2018 seems to be one of those years where there's a lot of change happening, where it's reflected in clothing and in music and in style generally. I don't think we know yet where that's going to go or how it's going to be viewed 20 years from now, but it does seem like one of those critical cultural moments.
So I'd like to, I'm going to ask a question of you two, actually. Mary, what was the first record that you bought?
First of all, I'm not sure how this turned into Keanan.
No, because I'm interested to, because I'm then going to ask you what was the first item of clothing that you bought that wasn't something that, your parents gave to you as a gift, or something that you actually made that kind of choice.
So this is going to be so hugely embarrassing. I loved the Monkees.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's great.
And I think the first record I bought was a 45 of some Monkees song.
That's great.
And the first item of clothing, I remember very specifically because I saved up my money to buy it. And I really, really wish I still had it. It was a brown suede leather vest with a tie here and fringe all the way down,
fantastic.
like midi fringe.
I can see it
was
already.
So awesome.
And Kyle, come on. I know it was your Kylie hot pants.
That's the first outfit I bought. No, the first record I bought, it's actually quite cool. It's Groove is in the Heart by Delight.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. The second one was a Kylie Minogue song. But the first item I bought myself that I saved up for doing a paper round was a pair of the Buffalo boots, the big stacked.
Oh, yeah.
The Spice Girls shoes that they then became. But yeah, I went all the way from London on a bus on my own to buy a pair of Buffalo boots that I saved up £100 for it. And
So you've really calmed down in your sort of footwear.
no. What's yours?
You know, I actually don't remember. I know the first record that I was given was the soundtrack to The Jungle Book. By my Auntie Gloria gave it to me for Christmas, and I loved it, the bare necessities and all of that. I don't remember. The first record that I bought was probably The Sweet or Slade. Maybe Mark Bolan, but I don't think it was Mark Bolan. Definitely wasn't Bowie. It definitely wasn't anything that was kind of cool. It was like a pop record, early 70s pop record.
And clothes?
Clothes. Nothing that would be a brand, but kind of skinny, sort of punk pants, probably, like 1977 or 70, maybe 78, probably.
So why did you ask the question?
No, I was just interested to know because I actually can't remember what the first record was that I bought, but I was wondering if there's any correlation between the clothing and the music, if it was actually of a moment in time, which I think it very much is.
Yeah. For me, it was, and maybe the only reason I remember that record distinctly is because my father smashed it.
Ooh.
Because he hated the music so much that. And the second thing I bought, I remember also, which was an album, the Mozart Requiem, which I blasted over and over and over. He didn't smash that one.
You got the biggest response from the audience, by the way, with your choices.
Oh, yeah.
So the monkeys and the fringed fringe suede.
Yeah.
There you go.
It was awesome.
That's the winner.
I'm telling you.
So I have a sort of perception here. So you're both musicians, right? You play, you sing, sing.
I sing badly, but yes, showers.
I'm terrible at music. I like music, but I don't do it. Do you think that is... I mean, I'm an observer of music. Not. I've tried to play the clarinet, I've tried to play the flute, the violin, all those things, and I just wasn't very good at it. Do you think that is something that... because I've got a thing about fashion designers, musicians that become fashion designers because they're musicians, and I've got a real bee in my bonnet about it. Just because they're rich and famous and, suddenly take on the name of, I'm a fashion designer. How do you feel about that?
Well, you're bringing up a very interesting point, I think, because until Mary and I were speaking about this, before we started this presentation, and in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s, so-called credible rock bands like Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles would never have allowed their music to be used in car commercials. So today where you get, the Chrysler car commercial with Led Zeppelin, or you get Led Zeppelin used in tons of movies, those artists didn't allow that to happen because it was kind of seen as selling out. That has changed. My own theory on that is that the explosion of hip-hop, hip-hop artists said, what we're making, we should be paid for, right? We're making art, but we should get a return on it. And they kind of took away the stigma from music being a commercial force. So whether you don't I don't particularly like hearing Led Zeppelin in a car commercial, but I think that ideology was actually a really good one, because today it's very difficult to make music by actually selling music. So having taken away, and this really, I think, happened in the 90s and in the 2000s, to take the stigma away from music being a business, I think that was probably a good thing. The other part of your question, though, is it really relates to income streams in music. In the music industry today, a lot of artists, when they get signed to what's called a 360 deal, which includes their merchandising, touring, sales of music, everything, basically. And so what it's done is it's pushed a lot of music artists to actually go beyond their merchandising and say, okay, I want to have a collaborative arrangement, or I want to work with a designer, or I want to set myself up as a designer. Some are very successful, some not so much. I believe that commerciality is what's driven it. And I think it's very much case by case. I totally hear what you're saying, that somebody who's successful in a certain field, stepping into another field because they have the means to do it financially and they have the support to do it, it doesn't necessarily make it a sound endeavor. But I think, it's interesting, we don't necessarily see classical musicians doing that yet. I'm not going to Topshop and seeing, the lead conductor of the New York Symphony Orchestra's new collection, a collaboration with Topshop.
I'd buy that.
Well, there's a different layer in this too, which is for a celebrity, a musician, to demonstrate an affinity for, or to be loyal to a brand, or to fashion itself. So when you talk about the classical music space, I don't know if any of you have heard of the pianist Yuja Wang. She's a young, very beautiful, dynamic, and really good pianist. But she created a huge scandal a few years ago when she was wearing couture clothes that were provocative, short dresses and more revealing clothing on stage. So, she represents some breakpoint moment for the classical world. I think also, Kyle, to go back to your point about the fact that you can't do music, you can still play music. You can enjoy music, and so it's one thing for a musical celebrity to say, "Oh yeah, I can become a fashion designer," but there is this huge space where musicians can align themselves with a brand or a particular designer and be basically an ambassador for that brand, which I think is part of some of the deals that people have.
It's also, when I was a kid growing up in the north of England, I would have loved to have had the jacket that David Bowie or Brian Ferry were wearing. I would have loved that. And if I could have gone into a fashion outlet at the time and bought that piece, I would have loved it. I used to sit at home and glue sequins on denim jackets and things just to try and create that. But I think what that could have done is actually demystified it, because for me, somebody like Mark Bolan or Brian Ferry, it looked like they came from outer space. Also, it sort of can become dangerous because only James Brown can wear that one piece. If you walk down the street wearing that, you can't carry it the way James Brown can carry it, for sure.
Nobody could scream like James Brown.
Nobody
either.
can scream like James Brown.
I think my point is more about, I agree with both of you in regards to the sort of attaching your name to a brand to be able to be, selling a pair of trainers or something. I think the thing that I find difficult as an educator, and I teach students and they go through 6 years of education, 4 years of a bachelor's degree, 2 years of a master's degree. They know their craft, they are fashion designers. And even you sticking sequins on a jacket is a fashion designer practicing being a fashion designer to be good at their craft. What I struggle with is when the celebrity is just, they just take the title of fashion designer, and then they get all the press and they steal all the limelight from the young, talented people that have put themselves through 6 years of education, and then get no stage, no space to present what they're doing, because these people who are stealing all that really, and that's coming from somebody that is a teacher, and I feel that there's something wrong in that for me.
Me too. I share that pain because, talking to students, they can get very demoralized by that fact. How can I compete with ASAP Rocky, because he's got, the whatever it is, another collection, or Pharrell or whoever that's doing something and actually doing something good. So how can I don't have that name, I don't have that name recognition, I don't have that audience, how can I compete with that? But I think, the fact is that students that do learn their craft, that have spent a number of years as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, that can't actually be taken away from them. I've worked with music, very well-known music icons who are not trained as designers. And it's evident when you sit down with them to merchandise a collection and they want to make 12 coats and, one dress. And you kind of go, well, you ain't going to sell 12 coats. They don't have that training. They don't have that craft. They don't understand how a garment's made. They are purely part of the marketing machine. Yeah. And it is quite, it's fleeting. It's not always successful. You see since probably the advent of Sean John and the Jennifer Lopez collections in the sort of late 90s, obviously Sean John's collections still around in one way, shape or form. Jennifer Lopez has kind of gone in and out of business several times, as have many of the other music icons who've launched collections. And yet you'll find, your student who graduated in 2000, they're still working today, and they're a senior designer or creative director in a fashion company, and they've had a career. Which a music icon that's sort of dabbling in it, they don't necessarily have. It's fleeting. And they don't necessarily make the money from it because they're on a 6% royalty. They have to be selling a bucket load of clothes to actually make money. So
it's an interesting point. I haven't actually thought of it like that. Thank you.
I bet some of your students, if a student graduated in 2000, they've made more of an impact in fashion and probably more of a financial return on that than a music icon has, who's launched a collection that was around for a couple of years and it was a licensing deal with Liam Fung or whoever.
I think you're right, to a point, but the days of being that new name and just like straight out of school and being seen as that new face of fashion, the innovators, the ones that are the McQueens and the Hussein Shalayans and the Gallianos, and that does still happen because of the LVMH projects, competitions. It's still there.
Sure.
But it's this that is getting the investors that would just throw some money at that amazing talent. It's less and less so now, I think.
I think it's also true in music. There are less small independent music outlets. Record stores have kind of depleted. Bookstores have depleted. Small independent fashion boutiques. So that business model, unfortunately, because of the price of real estate, has not really it's not sustainable anymore in the way that it was. And I think we just have to figure out ways to evolve. It's sort of happened. I don't know if any of you saw in the Times today, Spotify is going to be making a public offering. They are actually leading the charge in making a significant revenue stream for music, which is fantastic that things are actually starting to turn around a little bit, because music's been on this downward trend since Napster, since the 5 big record companies couldn't agree on how much to charge for an MP3.
And people would say that the apparel industry has been on a similar downward trajectory, and that retail's collapse has a lot to do with oversaturation of the marketplace, fast fashion coming in and undercutting lots of retail in the middle market and upper market, so that you're left with fast fashion and luxury and not a whole lot in between anymore.
Yeah. It's interesting. You'll see a little bit later in these slides, I kind of touched on the era of grunge very briefly, but I actually included some of the images from the Marc Jacobs Perry Ellis collection, which was really slated at the time. And he kind of lost his job at Perry Ellis because of that collection. And yet Kathy Horan, who was one of the biggest critics of it at the time, now she's saying, oh, well, actually it was quite good and it was quite influential and it was kind of a pivotal point. So, it's sort of, it's almost like the time plus rebellion plus money equals mainstream. Now it's kind of become part of the mainstream in a way. And I was sort of trying to illustrate that by playing the mashup of Kurt Cobain singing over the Jackson 5 which again, it's sort of two groundbreaking music artists in different genres, and yet the kind of danger of Nirvana over a period of time is lessened by just the way that the world's moved. Since 1991, 1992, we're in a very different era. You're kind of exposed to so much more in media. So Nirvana isn't as shocking. Marilyn Manson isn't as shocking, or if he ever was, as it was considered in that era.
Nothing is shocking anymore.
Well, all of this stuff. I mean, you can kind of Vivienne Westwood's, the naked cowboys, the tits T-shirts, all of that stuff. Pretty much today it's kind of ho hum. You can see, what's her name, Miley Cyrus and Katy Perry wearing all of this stuff. So it's not shocking. It was at the time, but it's not. It's all contextual, which is true of music as well. It's a contextual thing. When you take it out of a particular era, it's not as, possibly not as potent.
So I think another point, Keanan made this beautiful presentation, and I think these images also show how things come back. So there is the overlay and things losing their shock value, but there's a persistence of types of style that keep coming back. So if you look at the slides that are reflective of the 1920s and the streamlined effect, the glamour of those clothes, the relationship of that look to the sound of jazz. And then you fast forward to the 70s and you see that revival of a 20s kind of affect.
Yeah.
You could do that for every decade here, I think, that
sure.
things cycle back.
And also the drugs.
It never hurts.
Let's talk about the drugs, because drugs is prevalent in the music industry, it's prevalent in the fashion industry. If you look at the jazz age, all that mad flapper dancing, why were they doing that? They were high on cocaine, obviously.
And champagne.
And champagne and cocaine. Wait a minute, isn't that an Oasis lyric? So if you look at each of these eras, the counterculture is fueled by, LSD and the sort of expansion of the consciousness. Punk rock, again, like jazz, the similarities between punk and the 20s is the amphetamines. They couldn't afford cocaine, so they're all taking speed.
Your timing is perfect because we've got these guys.
We planned all this.
Keep dancing. So what's interesting, actually, about the Bee Gees picture is Morris is wearing a jacket from Granny Takes a Trip. So Granny Takes a Trip was a really fantastic boutique that started in the King's Road in London. They opened an LA outpost. And Gene Krell, who's the editor of Vogue Japan, Gene used to work in that store. And what was great about that picture is that was like 1977, so the Bee Gees were full-on disco fever mode, and yet Morris couldn't let go of his Granny Takes a Trip jacket, which must have looked really outre at that era, because he was wearing something from a hippie shop from like 5 years ago, which has probably seemed like an eon at that time. And to me, what that shows is that there's all of these helixes happening where, there's Donna Summer, who's put out a record called I Feel Love, which David Bowie says brings into the studio to play to Brian Eno and said, this is the future of music. So you've got that going on. And then you've got myself, a kid in Doncaster, going to gay pubs because that was the only place that you could go to where you could dress punk but not get your head kicked in by coal miners, and listening to I Feel Love by Donna Summer, not listening to the Sex Pistols, because my friends and I, we were listening to like disco music, the Village People and Donna Summer and George McRae, and
Stereotyping.
Am I?
No, I used to listen to them too.
No, but it's interesting how all that stuff kind of crosses over. There aren't finite elements, there aren't finite bookends in decades for music, and there aren't finite decades in fashion either. It's sort of, there's this kind of weird crisscross happening all the time. And when I look at punk, that's very much what punk was, a magpie thing, taking bits from rockabilly shoes and, you know, a draped jacket from the rock and roll era, and then maybe some glitter still, because all of those kids were Bowie fans and Roxy Music fans, and they were kind of trying to do the Bowie makeup, and, you know, so there was still a bit of that, and then there was this clutching on something that they thought maybe was the future, or maybe was a rebellion against, you know, the hippies and the era that had happened before them. And I think that happens very much in fashion too.
So Keanan, you said something the other day about sort of owning the title of the nickname that you're given by the subculture. You talked about, I forget what you said. You were talking about the mohawk in Mexico somewhere, and you mentioned something about queer and owning and the culture that was nicknamed queer as a derogatory term, and then.
Well, I was sort of, I think maybe I was talking about, so rock, who knows, so I'm sure some people will, maybe too shy to say anything, but who knows what rock and roll means? Anybody know what rock and roll means? Rock and roll means fucking. It's rocking and rolling. That's what it means. So the music terms that are applied to music are often derogatory, and they're often either applied by the subcultural force that music's being made by. For example, punk. A punk is a young male hustler, right? So punks were called punks to be, not by their own genre, they were called punks by others to malign them. And often what happens in music is, you know, like hippies, for example, you say, okay, you're going to call me a hippie? I'm going to be a hippie. I'm going to take it on, and it's going to be my flag and my badge of honor. And I think that's what's also fascinating about contemporary music, is it does take that and turn it around and sort of, you know, do the finger to the critics. But, you know, for me, that's very much what contemporary music has been about. It's actually taking that negative and spinning it around and turning it into the thing that you stand for. Absolutely. Yeah.
You can trace that back to jazz, too, and the
Sure.
derogatory nature of that word to begin with. But jazz has a really fascinating trajectory after that moment of it being rebellious and sort of upstart. Because it becomes a branch of respectable classical music eventually, with an intellectual veneer around it, with its own storytelling and history. It becomes like a third, it's not a third stream because that's something else, but it becomes a different branch that's somewhere between popular and classical music.
Well, what starts, I think, and it happens in fashion too. You know, you see a fashion, I hate the word trend, but you see a fashion trend happening. It's something that's interesting that you may be involved with. And then you see it hit critical mass and go into the mainstream, and you don't want it anymore. That's why fashion changes. But in the case of jazz, Tony Wilson, who founded Factory Records, which is the home of Joy Division and New Order, his famous phrase was, "Jazz is what you do when you can't get a gig doing real music." Right, so he was very derogatory about jazz, but it was, you know, he was sort of missing the point in a way, because he was looking at what jazz had come to represent by the mid-70s, which was sort of music that your dad listened to, and it was kind of safe. You know, your tweed jacket wearing art teacher with his corduroy trousers and his elbow patches, he listened to jazz. But that wasn't what jazz was. Jazz was this messed up, I mean, crazy music, cacophonous, syncopated, super rebellious, and everybody that was involved in it, from the undercurrent, you know, from it coming from an ethnic minority, from it coming from a subculture, and then finally hitting the mainstream and influencing the whole world since it began to the present day. You know, so I think in the 70s it probably lost its potency, and much in the same way that fashion does sometimes.
Go on.
I was just going to say, although some people would argue that progressive rock took up the cause of jazz. The tweed guys.
Everybody hates prog.
So an interesting side note in regards to fashion, music, and jazz. I have a student on the MFA Fashion Design program that's currently using the way in which you would build jazz music and sort of I mean, I'm not a musician again, but the way in which Wu is here in the audience, the way in which jazz is performed and built and sort of responding to each other playing, he's using that as a way to build patterns and tailoring. So it's like, it's a really interesting way that you can, fashion and music doesn't have to just be the way in which you wear clothes to listen to music or to perform music, but now, you know, at this level, they're using technique of building music to build clothing, so it's coming at it from a very different perspective, which I think is a really exciting and new way of looking how fashion and music have a relationship.
To me, when you're as an educator, when you're talking to an undergraduate or a master's design program, design class, one of the interesting things about bringing music into the classroom is not in the obvious way, actually not in this way, not in saying, okay, this is an era, this is how it looked, this was the music, and just taking that up as a mantle, but actually looking at the way the music is constructed. Prog is actually a great example, you know, because it's kind of stealing all those elements of classical music. It's about virtuosity, you know, so actually taking that as an influence in designing a fashion collection, not so you look like Rick Wakeman or the blokes from, what are they called, Yes, or Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but not with the
Although
cape.
they looked pretty good.
Oh, that's pretty good, yeah, the cape and the kind of ostrich feather boa and the long hair and the beer belly, which you definitely need for prog. But just taking the sort of process of music.
Kyle's sitting up straight all of a sudden.
Beer belly, Cal
The only people that are laughing at that are the people that are our generation who know what I'm talking about when I say prog, and everybody who's like kind of under 35 is going, what was this?
So where should we go from here?
Prince.
Let's go to
talk
Prince.
about Prince, because he's sexy.
I never liked Prince, I have to say that.
You don't like Prince?
Never liked Prince.
Good thing that didn't come out in your
He's
interview.
too short.
You didn't. Wait a minute. You didn't like those asymmetrically fastened trousers?
Never liked what he wore.
You didn't like the Cuban heel shoes?
And I don't like his music.
You don't like his music?
Just saying it, so I'm going to sit out of this one. And begin.
His name is Prince. He is sexy.
And he could play the guitar pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, the guy was a consummate performer. But anyway, Kyle, you have
Don't
your
hit me. We're all entitled to our opinion, right?
Let's talk about Kylie.
She's not up there yet.
She will be. She's coming.
I'll talk about Kylie.
Kyle wanted one particular slide in this presentation, and it was of
Kylie Minogue, the greatest influence in fashion, music, everything, in my opinion. No, not really. But I like Kylie. But we were talking about, the reason why I put Kylie in there was about how moments in time from music suddenly hit fashion, impacts fashion in a major way. And we've got a slide here of somewhere with Kylie Minogue in a pair of yellow gold hot pants from the Spinning Around record, where she literally, this video hits the mainstream MTV, and all of a sudden everyone, including myself, when I didn't have a beer belly, was wearing gold hot pants. And it's like, honestly, Topshop, Oxford Street, London, it was literally one of the biggest trends to hit fashion because one person wore a pair of hot pants in a video. And it was an amazing moment for me that actually blew my mind, how that one thing, that one moment in time, impacted fashion trends, cycles.
Yeah. So, I don't know if this slide came up yet, but there was a bunch of images from a great show that's on at the Museum of Modern Art at the moment. Was that on? Yeah, so there's a show called, it's all about Club 57, which I never went to. I didn't live in New York at that era, but my wife was a habitue of, and there was a picture of her sitting in the back of a cab with two of her friends, which is actually in that exhibit. And that was sort of like it's a fascinating show, which I really recommend you check it out, because not only, this was a club in the basement, and Nancy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this was a club in the basement of a church in the East Village, which didn't serve alcohol, so you had to get wrecked before you went there, and it was curated by a lady called Anne Magnuson, who is a performance and visual artist and actress. And the guys that work behind the bar you might have heard of. There's a guy called Keith Haring and another guy called Jean-Michel Basquiat, who used to paint stuff behind the bar. there were a whole bunch of performance artists who performed at the club and musicians. People like Klaus Nomi, who was an amazing opera singer, who was kind of like a new wave opera singer, and a whole bunch of other, way too numerous to mention. But please go and check out this exhibit if you haven't already, because it really shows an era in fashion when the underground in New York was really, really thriving. Manhattan's become a bit sanitized these days. I say that having lived here for 25 years, so I've been here a decent amount of time. But this was a place where it spawned artists like Madonna, for example, who went to that club quite a lot. And a lot of other iconic names. You'll see images of Andy Warhol and John Waters, and so people from the art world, the film world. But at that time, many of these people, not Warhol, but many of the others, were completely unknown. They were at the beginning of their career. And this club existed from 78 to 83, I believe. So again, it's sort of like crossing over the decades. But really worth looking at, because you'll see the amazing decorated garments that Keith Haring made from his now iconic graffiti images, which at the time he was going around the subways and kind of making his mark literally on the subway system in New York City. And you can see from the germ of that little conclave of people who were trying to do something. You could see the whole of the 80s and into the 90s playing out. And as Nancy always says to me, at that time, you know, she was coming out of college with no future, literally, like the Sex Pistols song No Future. You know, there wasn't an opportunity to get a job. There were no jobs. New York was bankrupt. And so they were just making cool shit because that's what they wanted to do. And from that, a lot of these people had a massive imprint on the creative arts generally, not just fashion and music, but way beyond. So please take a look at that if you get a chance. We're coming to a bit of the last bit of the slideshow, which I kind of called the music fashion mashup. And I was just really looking at what Kyle was sort of alluding to earlier, which is musicians that are having an influence on fashion. And one of the musicians that, you know, I mean, this guy's super talented. Pharrell is an amazing producer, amazing performer, great singer. But he's also, I think, truly involved in fashion in a way that it's not just dabbling. He's a major shareholder in G-Star. So he's invested in that company. He's invested in Bionic Yarn, which is an organization that's involved in taking plastic bottles out of the sea and making them into a filament yarn that can be woven into fabric. So this is a guy who loves the aesthetic of fashion, loves wearing clothes, but he's actually taken a really deep dive into the industry in a way that I think resonates in a really sound way. So I agree with you, there are a lot of people that are dabbling, and they are dabbling and probably preventing some emerging talents from having space in the industry, but there are also guys like Pharrell, who I believe are really sound.
I agree. I think Pharrell's
well, I am too. I mean, he's I think the same. Very interested in the technology of fashion. Very interested in the sustainability of fashion in a really sort of solid and sound way. So I do applaud talents like that are really exceptional in the field that they're in, and then coming into fashion and actually doing it in a credible way.
It's authentic. I mean,
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, there's an authenticity to it that is missing in those other spaces.
But if you think back to that image of Pharrell and Karl Lagerfeld, it works the other way too. Lagerfeld has been deeply interested in music, both as a voracious consumer of it, but also as a supporter of Parisian cultural institutions through Chanel and personally. And that reminds me of Pierre Berger and Yves Saint Laurent, who were heavily, especially Berger, heavily committed to making sure that the Paris Opera. Oh, sorry,
Really quick.
gotta stop.
It's Kylie.
Can't talk about the Paris Opera while Kylie's mini shorts are
The
up
gold
there.
shorts.
Gold hot pants.
She's slogging
So much more
sluggy.
important.
So definitely not.
Go, Kyle. Speak about the shorts.
Come on.
It's more to say, really. I mean, it's just they literally changed the face of Oxford Street, London, overnight. That's all I was saying.
Face, probably not the right word, but...
Okay.
No, all I was going to say was Pierre Berger was eventually the head of the Paris Opera prior to his death. So I think that the influences and the commitment go both ways.
So, shall we open it up to questions?
Yeah, please, let's.
So, there's a microphone over there. If you wouldn't mind grabbing that. Gina, would you do me a favor and grab the microphone there and hand it around to anyone that might have a question? I'm not asking you to sing, don't worry. Does anybody have a question?
Or comments?
Kira has a question there. If you could just hand that to Kira there at the front. Thank you, Gina. Sorry to jump on you, I just saw you in the corner.
I was curious, actually, for all of you, what's on your playlist currently?
So I'm going to do a shameless plug for my radio show. Thank you for that. You teed that up beautifully for me. So I do a radio show every Tuesday night, 6 to 8 p.m., Little Water Radio. The URL will come up in a second. So I'm kind of compiling playlists. That's perfect. Planted you in the audience. So I'm kind of making playlists every week, and I usually do it. This show started a couple of years ago. It was supposed to be a fashion on the radio show, and so I invite guests, not as often as I would like to. And my good friend Alex, who's here this evening, is a fantastic musician and amazing audio engineer as well. And we worked together on the radio show for a while. He's just come off tour with his band Velt, who've been touring, so he's probably glad not to be sleeping in the back of a van tonight. I'm always compiling playlists, and they're usually thematic. So each show is a particular theme. The most recent one that I enjoyed putting together was a so-called LA playlist, which actually this band is not from LA, they're from Austin, but they kind of have a very psychedelic LA sound. The Black Angels. So Black Angels, Lemon Twigs, a very young band from LA whose drummer is 16, and they're called Starcrawler. So very kind of psychedelic and rock and roll music.
That's kind of interesting, thinking about where music is evolving too, and I'm wondering how that's paralleling in fashion, because what you're talking about is these sort of aggregations of multiple artists, as opposed to, for instance, taking one artist with a sort of more traditional idea of their collection, their album, right? I wonder if there are parallels in that to be considered about fashion.
Well, so when I'm talking to students about designing a collection, I use the example of an album. So on an album, generally, your 2 up-tempo songs are then followed by the 3rd track is going to be a ballad or a slower track. It's kind of like merchandising a collection. You can't, unless you're like doing full-on dark wave or techno, it's not for the whole album. Otherwise, you just go crazy. Similarly, in a collection, it can't be all coats, Gwen Stefani. It can't be all coats, because you can't sell that many coats, Gwen. So, you kind of have to build it like building a record. Unfortunately, artists, I think what happened in the 80s was the CD made the album time jump from 38 minutes, which it was on vinyl, to 70 minutes, and everybody felt they had to fill it up because the consumer felt if they weren't getting 70 minutes, they weren't getting their money's worth. So the actual art of creating an album changed totally, as did the artwork and the scale of it. So I think we've hit that with fashion as well. The collections have become not necessarily extended in the way an album did, but so many collections per year. It used to be spring, summer, autumn, winter, then cruise came in, then resort, then da-da-da, all these other elements, deliveries came into fashion. And the delivery into store got completely out of sync with the season. So when you go into store to buy swimwear, you're confronted with wool coats, and when you go in to buy a wool coat, it's all summer. So the whole fashion calendar got completely messed up. And I think that's been really symbiotic with what's happened in music, the kind of feel that we have to fill up that 70 minutes. Now we're in an era where it's all about streaming, and people don't buy albums anymore. So the art of the album has actually faded away. And I don't know how many of you are, old enough to remember buying an album and playing it, put on Wizard of Oz and put on Dark Side of the Moon and see where it all syncs up. But I don't think listeners enjoy music like that anymore. It's track by track, which is kind of what it was like in the 50s. When pop music was happening in the 50s, people were buying singles. They weren't really buying albums. The album was the creation of the mid-60s, the Beach Boys, the Beatles, other artists that created more conceptually driven collections of songs. Before that, it was just singles.
The history of the album is a really fascinating history, and I think it does align with the history of developing collections. But it feels now like we're in a moment where the systems have just broken down, so that everything is individualized, everything is separated. What do you think, Keanan and Kyle? What happens next?
So it's really interesting what you just said, both of you. I mean, my current work around shrinking fashion from a sort of a scale thing, and also from a mental health to shrink, to go to a psychiatrist, in terms of sort of the amount of pressure we put on ourselves to be creative, to be good, to produce a collection 20 times a season, which creates sort of issues, right? And I always talk to my students about, taking time and enjoying the development of a collection, like you would producing an album. We don't expect musicians to produce 8 albums a year, and if we did, then there would be pressures on them to be, that's not good. I think where we go next is to try and slow it down, and to try and give value to it in the way that it used to be, in terms of, just something that's honest and true, and sort of, you connect to the person that's doing it. You're connecting to them like you would an artist, or a moment in time where it meant something. It wasn't just doing it to sell more music or to sell more clothes. You're doing it to be a fashion designer or to be a musician, simply to design, to make something, to make money. And I think that's the bit that I'm really trying to embody within the program, is to just do something because it's in you to do it, not because you're trying. And of course, hopefully, if you're good enough, your customer will come to you because it's good enough, and you'll make money from being authentic, as opposed to simply putting stuff out there to make money, which we all need. But it's that's where I think we need to go. I know it's not that easy, but
Come on, more questions from the audience.
we didn't finish the playlist one. Actually, Mary, what was your playlist?
So I'm not a huge playlist person, I realize now that you've posed that question. I like diving into things, and so I really don't have a good playlist answer.
I'm not a playlist person either. I get obsessed. I can't say this very well, but I'm into Ludovico Einaudi, a classical pianist that's just really contemporary, very beautiful, melodic, calming. And we need the calming, and of course Kylie. Any more questions? Go on, Brenda. We have one down
Professor
the front.
Cowan.
I don't know that it's a question necessarily, but I'm curious what pops into each of your minds when I ask about the fine line between somebody being influenced, right, which is music. I've been influenced by X and make my own music, right, and fashion. Same thing. What's the fine line between being influenced and celebrating somebody prior and plagiarizing or appropriating? Go!
I'll take the first stab at this because I'm going to go back to the Middle Ages and to the idea of borrowing in music, which goes back to Gregorian chant and chant pre-Gregory. So that the earliest music, a lot of it was built on pre-existing tunes, and that was the way that people composed. They would take a chant melody, a religious melody, and embellish it, and use that as the basis for a new composition. And then the next generation of people would take that previous generation's take on the chant and build it out further. Sometimes there would be direct appropriation, sections of an earlier composition. Musical borrowing was conventional from the very beginning. So the issues of appropriation have, from the get-go, been blurry.
I've never done an original thing in my entire life, so I mean, I remember I used to listen to, there was a radio DJ in England called John Peel, and his show was on 10 till midnight, 5 days a week. And so I used to listen to it in my bedroom as quietly, with headphones, as quietly as possible. And probably late 81 or maybe early 82, I was still living at home, so I kind of shouldn't really make too much noise. But he played this track that was by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, and it was called Wheels of Steel. And it was essentially where the idea of sampling kind of originated, I believe, from Grandmaster Flash and from probably Afrika Bambaataa also. And what they were doing was basically taking not just 2 turntables, but 5 turntables. 5 turntables was the maxim. And they made a record by essentially mashing up Queen's Another One Bites the Dust, Chic's Good Times, a bit of Blondie, a bit of dialogue from a movie, a whole bunch of tracks live. If you imagine syncing tracks together live on turntables, it was recorded in a studio, but it wasn't done with all of the Pro Tools and Logic audio that we have today. It was actually done live with the Furious Five rapping over the top of it live. And it was like, I was lying in bed and I heard this and I was like, fuck, what's this? And then my dad came running in, like, looking on the, what's wrong? Oh, I just heard this amazing record. And for me, that was totally cool. I don't think it was, it was stealing in a way, but it was making a completely different piece of art out of bits of other pieces of art. And a friend of mine who's in the band Blondie has no problem with it at all. He thinks that was amazing, totally cool. The whole band does. They think it's totally amazing and totally cool. Blondie never sued Grandmaster Flash. They never went after him for royalties or any of that stuff. I don't think Queen did. I don't think any of the other artists did, because they recognized it was a completely new piece of art made from other bits. The flip side of that is Led Zeppelin taking certain tracks from actually reinterpreting, but really just playing their version with slightly altered lyrics of originally composed blues music, Willie Dixon and many other artists, and passing that off as their composition. That is stealing and cultural appropriation, and which Led Zeppelin actually did correct later, but only when they were pushed. So I think there's kind of a line where you take elements and make something completely new from it, or whether you just take something and pass it off as your own originality.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. I mean, one of the things, that sounds like an amazing combination of things that you respond to and then making them your own by layering them up and, turning it into something new. One of the things that I've done on the MFA fashion design program is that we have an amazing archive here at FIT, as you all know, in the museum. And next semester we have a course called Design Archaeology, which we will be accessing the archives to look at original pieces by designers and to analyze them like you would an archaeologist. And sort of the point of that course is that the students will be designing collections from moments in time in fashion history, but making them their own. And part of the reason I designed that was to get them to realize the difference between plagiarism, being inspired by, and turning it into something new. So it's, I think that was just the perfect example of a music version of what I'm trying to do with that course.
And to take it down from that high plateau, we could talk about fast fashion and the reinterpretation of elevated design or haute couture turned around very quickly and very cheaply for a mass market. And the implications of that go from issues of sustainability and damage to the planet, to fair labor, to the economic impact of a system that is so vast and so underpriced.
Ooh, any more?
Bummer.
Hi. Any more questions? Let's do one more. Come on, I'm sure there's one more out there. There you go, Lucy. Thank you, Gina. Extra credit.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a really interesting conversation to listen to. So thank you very much, all of you. I don't really know whether I have a question as such, but Carl will know that that I'm very, very interested in the future. And I've found it interesting because most of the conversation has been looking at the past and kind of looking at tribes of how people kind of express themselves and how that kind of passed on to the consumer. And I'm kind of more interested in the future and how things are going to pan out, and wondering, I haven't really considered, as a fashion educator myself, how music may change in the future. And I was just wondering if you've got any views on that whole idea of looking forward rather than looking back. And I know we do that a lot in fashion, and we kind of look at eras, we look at things, we look at different objects. But what happens if the other thing I'm interested in is time travel. What happens if we project ourselves, 50, 100 years in the future and look back and try and see, how things may look to other people? I mean, it's an incredibly interesting time we're living in where so much is changing. So much is changing. The way we shop, the way we think, the way we live our lives. And that's got to kind of reflect in certain ways in fashion. And I know there's the big fashion revolution that's happening in London, Who Made My Clothes, all those hashtags, and some fantastic things being done. But yeah, that's not a question really, but I'd love to hear your comments on
Can I
some
just,
of those
one thing I
starting
would like to
points.
say. For me, it's always about how things are made, right? How things have been made, how things are made, and how things will be made, and that's the future. So how is clothing made will influence the design of clothing, and how music is made will influence the way the music sounds. I think it comes down to materiality and the production of the item, whether it's a sound or a piece of clothing. I think that's where the future lives. It's really funny hearing you talk, because you sound like me. I'm talking about the future historian and how we look at our work from 100 years from now and what impact our decision making now has on the future. So it's you can tell we worked together a long time ago. But yeah, I mean, you were nodding, so I think maybe.
Yeah, when I look at the evolution and advancements in both fashion and music, they're often driven by a new piece of technology. So if you look at the Industrial Revolution, that's when fabric was mass-produced. That's when clothing stopped being made, not stopped, but moved from being made at home to being made in a factory situation. When you think about music, it was played live by an orchestra, and then a jazz quartet, and so on and so forth. And then it started to be able to be recorded and distributed in a different way, and radio started. So you see these big movements from the jazz era. Music really changed because it became more mass. Fashion is the same. When a new piece of technology impacts on fashion, it allows fashion to evolve. The industrial sewing machine, the industrial fabric loom, so on and so forth. But even the evolution of the way fashion is distributed today, digitally, in terms of e-commerce and in terms of the marketing of fashion. So I think we're probably on the cusp of some big changes in fashion, and I think you're going to see Barney's new ad campaign is all what's it called when you put one of those headsets on and the whole virtual reality. You're going to see virtual surreality. You're going to see an evolution of that, which probably is a bit hokey and a bit clumsy right now. But as things move forward, I kind of sort of look forward to the day when we're post-fashion, to be honest. Raise your hands if you don't have enough clothes or shoes or hats. You've got a walk-in wardrobe. No.
I'm not anti-tech, and I definitely see what you're both pointing out, but I think the future also relies on people and on a commitment to beauty and some kind of taste, however that gets expressed. So when I think back on the Middle Ages and the music I was just talking about, that evolution was based on a passion that had to do with beauty and bringing beauty into the world and expressing it in new ways. The technology, I believe, will be a tool for that, but it's always going to be the drive to have beauty in our lives and in future, whatever aliens take over the planet
I think
in
it's
their
the
lives.
interface between hand and machine, right? The machine doesn't do anything unless the humanity and the beauty is the input. I'm going to close it down here, guys.
It's very inspirational.
As rainbows and unicorns go over our head. I just want to say, first of all, thank you, Keanan and Duffty, for coming in. You've been an absolute eye-opening, wow. What don't you know about it is what I want to ask. You know, it's absolute walking encyclopedia of fashion and music. So thank you very much. And thank you, Dean, Mary Davis, for making this possible, for everything that you do for us. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Kyle, for putting this all together and for bringing us together. And thank all of you for being here.
Cheers for coming
Thank you,
out.
everyone.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.